John chapter 9, long ago, there was a widowed Chinese farmer. The farmer and his only son labored through the cold winter winds and summer's scorching rays with their last remaining horse. One day, the son didn't lock the gate of the stable properly, and the horse bolted away. When the neighbors learned what happened, they came to the farmer and said, "What sadness this is. Without your horse, you'll be unable to maintain the farm. What a failure that your son didn't lock the gate properly. What a tragedy." To which the farmer replied, "Maybe yes, maybe no, we'll see." The next day, the missing horse returned to the farmer's stable, bringing 6 wild horses with it. The farmer's son locked the gate behind all of the 7 horses, and when the neighbors learned what had happened, they came to the farmer and said, "What happiness this brings. With 7 horses, you'll be able to maintain the farm with 3 of them and sell the rest for huge profits. What a blessing." To which the farmer replied, "Maybe yes, maybe no, we'll see." The next day, the farmer's son was breaking in one of the wild horses, and the son got bucked from the horse, fell on some rocks, and broke his leg. When the neighbors learned what had happened, they came to the farmer and said, "What a great sadness this is. Now you'll be unable to count on your son's help. What a failure to break in the horse properly. What a tragedy." To which the farmer replied, "Maybe yes, maybe no, we'll see." The next day, a general from the Imperial Chinese Army arrived to conscript the village's young men for service. Their assignment was to fight on the front lines of battle against a terrifying enemy of overwhelming force. The farmer's son, because he had broken his leg, was not taken. When the neighbors learned what had happened, they came to the farmer and said, "What a great joy. Your son avoided facing certain death on the front lines of battle. What a blessing." To which the farmer replied, say it with me, "Maybe yes, maybe no, we'll see." You know, for those unfamiliar, this story is commonly referred to as the story of the Chinese farmer, or the old man who lost his horse. The parable, that's been interpreted many ways, appears in many places, from pop culture to children's stories to philosophical textbooks to psychological lectures and leadership lessons, and as you might expect, in religious contexts. The story shows our human tendency to act like the neighbors. We quickly judge tragedy or triumph, good or bad, gain or loss. Despite our own limitations and inability to uncover the whole story, we invest massive amounts of energies into brashly judging, evaluating, and adjudicating every situation that comes our way. We label our circumstances as a dead end. We call our maladies losses. We deem our financial windfalls gains. We speculate for situations. We judge ourselves for not making progress. We dismiss others because of their station. We become angry for feeling overlooked, and we feel hopeless about all of our prospects. And if we're honest this morning, these seem to be our default settings. We will often make definitive judgments about tragedy or triumph, good or bad, gain or loss, even though we have no control over what tomorrow brings. We don't yet know the whole story, and we're still just wet clay waiting to be formed. In other words, we tend to make these bold, final judgments about almost every situation we encounter, even though the story is still incomplete. And the story of the Chinese farmer encourages us to contemplate what it might mean to emulate the farmer, to try to suspend our judgment regarding what defines tragedy or triumph, fortune or misfortune, because without this type of open posture, without a kind of we'll see posture, we're gonna focus on speculations rather than being fully present to the situations that are in front of us. Put differently, we are often blinded by our own judgments. And it makes it very difficult to see with clarity how we might wait a little longer, walk a little further, and work the works that are actually in front of us. And we begin with these themes from a very old parable because they set up our conversation about the sixth sign in John's gospel, the penultimate sign, which concerns speculations and evaluations and judgments about a person who is blind since birth. If you have it open, look there with me, John chapter 9, verse 1. As he, that is Jesus, walked along, he saw a human, your translations might say man, quite literally, a human blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, that word means teacher, who sinned, this person or his parents, so that he was born blind? Jesus here exits the temple following a long series of interactions through chapter 7 and 8 during the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus has been engaging with those who do not see. Notice that language, those who do not see clearly. He's debating with those who want to remain in darkness, and he's working among those who continually make negative evaluative judgments about his ministry. And as he walks out of the temple, his own disciples seize their own opportunity to pass a certain kind of judgment, and they ask Jesus a question about a person who is blind from birth. The disciples want to know here, who sinned? What is the cause of this blindness? Like the neighbors in the story of the Chinese farmer, the disciples here want to make a quick value judgment about a person in front of them. You see, the disciples actually here have already made their evaluative judgment. This is clearly not good. It's a tragedy. It's terrible. And so they want to know the cause. But notice that their presented options when they ask Jesus the question, their presented causes are limited. They assume, in conjunction with the broader debates of their time, that sin is the cause. And so they just want to know whose sin it was. The disciples here form a brash, unfair judgment based on a situation that, to be honest, they don't really understand. And while I think we might be inclined to judge the disciples, this type of negative evaluation happens often in our own lives. Are you with me? We know little about someone's past or present. We avoid listening. We don't exercise much patience. We don't join them on the journey. Instead, we make judgments, evaluations, and prescriptions about their situations and circumstances. The simple facts are clear in the story. There is a man who was born blind, and he remains blind to this moment. And while the disciples want to preoccupy themselves with an academic exercise in theological hair splitting, here sits a real human being. Not a test case, not a cause for speculation, an actual person with a significant impairment. And rather than seeing this person as an actual person, they turn it into an opportunity to speculate about causes. I think we have to imagine here that the disciples are the last in a very long line of people to make judgments and assumptions about this person. And follow me, even if they could identify faults here, the situation would still remain unchanged. The blind person sitting in front of them is reduced to nothing more than an object of their own theological curiosity. He's been neglected by the authorities, overlooked by the crowds, and here now he's being speculated over by the disciples. It seems to me that we often fail to take the time, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally, to see the whole picture. And as a result, I think we lack compassion for the people who are sitting right in front of us. Sometimes we're even unaware of the facts that are necessary to make a real judgment. We allow our frustrations with someone to cloud our judgment, preventing us from giving them the benefit of the doubt. We indulge our pride, savoring the feeling of superiority that comes from critiquing other people. Hidden envy might lead us to judge those in our lives whose lives we secretly desire, while a guilty conscience can push us to believe that others are worse off despite our own flaws. And these and various other factors, I think they make fertile ground for unfair and unkind judgments. As the theologian Benedict Pisset once put it, we often judge rashly and condemn them without knowing the facts, and always without understanding them. In doing so, we erode a little by little and eventually ruin the love that we must have for the one we condemn. The more we judge him guilty, the less disposed we are to love him. I wonder this morning as we begin, where do we need to suspend judgment in our own lives? In what ways have we become like the neighbors in the parable and the disciples of Jesus in this story, rushing to proclaim not good, tragedy, terrible? Because our lives are filled with these same kinds of experiences. We'll say to ourselves, that person doesn't deserve the miracle. Sin defines their life. They're beyond redemption, a hot mess to be left by the roadside. But the gospel always says, we'll see. You know, I was one of those. A broken family plagued by addiction, all sorts of negative coping patterns, spewing untruths, leaving a carnage in the wake of everything that I touched. And I was told to my face on numerous occasions that I was beyond redemption. I'd become nothing more than a cause for the evaluative judgments of other people. And it was not until someone slowed down and entered in and walked alongside of me that my life was transformed. See, we want to make value judgments, but the gospel always says we'll see. And Jesus here is about to reveal the we'll see that marks his gospel. John chapter 9, verse 3, Jesus answered, listen, guys, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But so that God's works might be revealed in him, it is necessary that we work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. See, when questioned here by the disciples, notice that Jesus does not actually respond directly. We're often thrown off by a little period that comes between verses 3 and 4. Instead, Jesus here redirects the disciples from making evaluative judgments to actively participating in the work of God in redemption. It seems to me that when we read these verses, we all too frequently put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Jesus doesn't answer the question, but in a typical rabbinic fashion, like a good teacher, Jesus redirects our attention. See, often here we assume that Jesus answers the disciples' question by directing attention away from sin as the cause and toward God as the cause. We interpret Jesus here as suggesting that God is the one responsible for the blindness, without realizing that in the process, we're implying that God is the author of suffering, blindness, and disease solely to reveal his own glory. And many interpreters and preachers and readers of this text, I think, seem to fall into the same trap as the disciples, although their emphasis is not on sin as cause, but God as cause. We speculate together about the problem of evil and suffering, and we accidentally portray God as the author of evil. And if we're honest, I think we do this often. We claim together, without really knowing the whole story, that God is the one causing the problems. Maybe that's you. You're here this morning and you don't really know God, but you see God as the cause of the problems. And Jesus here, if we read carefully, you can realize that Jesus doesn't actually answer their question at all. Jesus doesn't blame God for darkness. Instead, he attributes his work to God's work, not as the one who creates darkness, but as the one who brings forth the light. Jesus actually here points his disciples in one of two ways. He says, listen, number one, we can make evaluative judgments together. We can speculate about causes all day. People do it all the time. Or two, you know what we could do instead? Work the works of the one who called us so that the light might be revealed. It's almost like Jesus, here's my Eugene Peterson paraphrase. Jesus says, look guys, we can speculate all day, but we need to ask ourselves, do we want God's glory to be revealed in this person? Because if so, we have work to do. Jesus moves them away from evaluation judgments and towards the work we are called to do. See, we'll quickly judge whether an issue might stem from sin or the demonic or even God, but Jesus, our great teacher, he redirects us to the only thing that's actually in our control. As followers of Jesus, we're called to be agents of the light. Notice here in your text, Jesus doesn't say, I have work to do. He says, we have work to do. We must do the works of the one who's called us while it's still light. Because light has come into the world. And listen, if you're in this room and you're like me, you may be liberated from the darkness, but there are many in our world, in our city, in our nation who remain in darkness, and we have a role to play with God in their liberation. The disciples are like the neighbors, they speculate. Jesus here is like the farmer. Maybe yes, guys, maybe no, but listen, the gospel always says we'll see. And the we'll see approach here implies that while we don't know what appears as a tragedy today might be revealed as good tomorrow. We don't know the ways in which today's tragedy can become tomorrow's comedy. If you've lived long enough, you know, and how the terrible can actually be transfigured tomorrow into triumph. And part of Jesus' correction here is to move us away from speculating, away from judgments, and towards the work that we are called to do in partnership with God. Jesus says clearly, chapter 9, verse 4, in order that the works of God might be revealed in him, we must work the works of the one who sent me. Work the works. Just work. The question here shifts from where are we speculating and making judgments towards what work do we need to do in partnership with God? Where do we need to set aside our judgments and acknowledge together that the story isn't over yet and there's work for us to do? So Jesus here then calls us to get back to work. He calls us to roll up our collective sleeves and get our hands dirty, to start playing with the raw materials, to get out there in the world and spit into somebody's eyeballs. John chapter 9, verse 6, when he said this, he spat on the ground and created clay. From the saliva, he spread the clay on the eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. Then he went and washed, and the blind man came back seeing. Our daughter Alethea is almost 4 now. Our son Atticus just turned 2, and we're at that disturbing age where if you leave them in a room alone for more than 15 seconds, you might return to one of them smearing mud all over the other one's eyeballs. This scene should be triggering to all the young parents in the room. My daughter will frequently ask me the most bizarre but honestly interesting questions. I mean, she'll ask out of nowhere, can I lick your eyeball? To which I respond, absolutely not. And she says, why? And then you remember as a parent that we are all actually deep down disgusting creatures, and someone had to teach us at one point not to lick someone else's eyeball. I mean, I've been asked on a couple of occasions, why, can I smear mud all over your face? And then I ask, why would you want to put mud on my face? And she says, so the glory of God might be revealed in you. No, she's 4, she's never said that. She just says, it might be good. To which I respond, can I rub mud on your face? She says no, and we move on. This scene here in John chapter 9 is disturbingly unhygienic. But notice the specific language that John uses, and our translations don't quite capture what's happening here. It says, Jesus spits into the dust of the ground, and quite literally, he creates clay, apoiesin pelon. He makes clay. Notice here, Jesus is portrayed using a very common biblical metaphor. Jesus is here being portrayed by John as the potter. Jesus is the potter, the creator, refashioning the human who is made of clay. As the prophet Isaiah puts it in chapter 64, and now, O Lord, you are our Father, and we are clay. We are all the works of your hands. See, here Jesus shows us exactly what the works of God are. The works that we've been called to take up as his people, and they've been the same works since the beginning. We're called to participate in the remaking, the refashioning, the reforming, not only of ourselves, but others. That the great work that God is doing in the world is restoring his image in us and in others. That God's actually remaking us. We are like clay that's being refashioned by the potter. It was Irenaeus of Lyons, who was one of the earliest commentators on this text. He actually commented on it this way. He said, to that man, however, who had been blind from birth, he gave sight not by means of a word, but by an outward action. Doing this not without a purpose or because it so happened, but that he might show forth the hand of God, that which at the beginning had molded man. And therefore, when the disciples asked him for what cause the man had been born blind, whether for his own or his parents' fault, Jesus replies, neither had this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be manifest in him. And then he says this, now the work of God is the fashioning of man. The disciples focus on the source, but Jesus is focused on the solution. Are you with me? The sign performed like Jesus here, much like the other signs we've examined in the gospel, and I would argue in our own lives, is not just about the literal miracle. I think if we focus solely on the miracle, we can overlook not only the one who has created, but who is recreating, and we can miss the mission of the one behind the miracles. See, Jesus' mission is to take us, the clay, and to remake us, to restore us to our original state. Jesus' mission is not to save souls, but to remake humanity. Jesus' mission is to transfigure the darkness and apocalypse the light. Jesus' mission is to refashion all of us. Are you with me? The miracle here then is not so much about blindness as it is about the restoration of the whole person so that we can move from darkness to light, from not seeing to seeing, from death to life. As we sang together this morning, this text is saying something very similar. You're not done raising me. Now let's change the metaphor. You're not done working with me yet. I'm still clay that's waiting to be refashioned by you, the potter. Jesus here sends the man to the pool of Siloam. He goes and washes in this water, and the man comes back seeing. If you read the verses that follow, and we don't have time for that this morning, but if you read them, you'll notice that in the 7 scenes portrayed by John in John chapter 9, in these 7 scenes, there's only one individual who sees clearly. You know who it is? The man who was previously blind. Everyone else in the story is blind to what Jesus is doing and who he is, except for this man. We are clay, waiting to be refashioned by the potter. You know, I think often preachers and people like me have popularized an analogy that's actually really unhelpful. We'll often say that we are broken things and God is putting us back together, but the scriptures actually use a different analogy. The scriptures never use the analogy of a broken pot that's being put back together. The scriptures always use the analogy that we are lumps of clay and the potter continues to try to work with us, which can only mean one thing, that God is not finished with you yet. It can only mean one thing, that God is not finished with me yet. I'm not a finished vessel that needs to be put back together. I mean, that metaphor doesn't even allow for change or partnership with God or being a part of our own formation. Instead, the picture of Scripture and the picture we see here in Jesus is one who takes us as clay and reworks us again and again and again so that we can become a beautiful and useful vessel for his kingdom. Jesus reveals here that we follow the God of the will see. Our God is the God of the will see. The miracle of the man born blind here is a stern reminder to us this morning that God is remaking us by his Spirit, not so much because we are broken, but because he's not finished yet. And if you're in the room and you've ever worked with clay before, you know one thing to be true. Clay has a particular reputation among potters. If you ask a potter what it's like to work with clay, here's what they'll say. Clay has a mind of its own. Clay will push back and fall off center. It will resist what the potter's hands is trying to turn it into. And this is the analogy the scriptures choose. We are those who resist the hands of the potter. And sometimes we end up in painful seasons because the potter is wedging us back down into a lump so he can begin to rework us again. And sometimes we find ourselves on the precipice, just so close to feeling as though we are that beautiful and useful vessel. But regardless of where we are, that story's just not over yet. Friends, you're not broken in need of being put back together. You're wet clay that needs to put itself back into the hands of the potter because it's just not over yet. I wonder this morning, in what ways do you need to entrust yourself to the potter's hands? In what ways are you trusting your own hands rather than the hands of Jesus to remake you? See, the refrain of our story is clear. We can sit around and make evaluative judgments. We can label things as tragedy or triumph, good or bad, gain and loss. But as we do that, we find ourselves descending further and further into darkness. And our story, our teaching text this morning reminds us that a key part of our discipleship journey is learning to say again and again and again, maybe yes, maybe no, we'll see. Because the Father, through the Son, by the Spirit, continues to work in us and through us and among us, and the story is not over yet. God is working to bring forth light in our lives and in our neighbors' lives and in the world. And in order to see it in our lives, we need to adopt this great will see posture. Because ultimately we know, if you've read the end of the story, that there is a great will see. When God's dwelling is going to be among us. When every tear will be wiped away and death and grief and crying will be no more. When the bad is made good and tragedy is finally turned to triumph and mourning is turned to dancing. As J.R.R. Tolkien famously put it, when catastrophe becomes eucatastrophe. Eu is the Greek word for good. When the bad, when the tragedy, when the catastrophe is transformed to the good. I want to remind us this morning of one very simple thing. And one thing I think we see in our teaching text is that Jesus calls us as his disciples to live into the will see posture, to suspend our judgments, because if we're honest, they're distractions. And instead, I think we need to redirect our focus to the tasks we are called to undertake so that God's glory might be revealed through our transformation and the transformation of others. This way, the light can actually penetrate all darkness as we adopt this great will see posture in the present in anticipation of the great will see in the future. So 3 things this morning then as you're taking notes. First, Jesus calls us to suspend judgment. You want to speculate about causes, why things are going the way they're going. Or maybe you want to say, this isn't good, it's bad, it's a tragedy, therefore I'm going to make a final judgment about it today. And our text wants to press on us a little bit this morning and say, but the story's not over yet. That we actually have to adopt a will see posture. Second, we need to engage the works that we've been called to work. There's work to do, are you with me? And I can't help but think, as I was preparing for this teaching this morning, that in a series where we're talking about miracles and growing faith in God's work in our lives, it stands to reason that there are people in your lives and mine whose miracle is not yet fulfilled because you have not yet taken up the work of being the fulfillment in that miracle. God, through you, by the Spirit, as you engage the work, is actually how other people are going to experience God's hands. The miracle that we're waiting for, the answers to our prayers, to say it differently, most of our prayers would be answered if the saints took up the works we've been called to work. There's a job for us to do. And finally this morning, I wonder what it looks like for you to recognize that you are not something broken that God's just trying to put back together, but you're still just wet clay. And it's just not over yet. And the potter is so faithful. He's so faithful to continue to take us, to wedge us down, to put us back on the lathe and start to rework us again and again. And when we fall off center and things go poorly or bubbles start to emerge, the potter wedges us down, puts us back on the lathe and begins to work us once more. FA Church, may we suspend our judgments over situations and circumstances. May we engage the works that we have been called to work in partnership with God. And may we entrust ourselves to the potter who is refashioning us and our neighbor and the world. And ultimately this morning, may we become a people who are not all about yes and no, but a people who can live into the will see in the present as we anticipate the fulfillment of that great will see in the future. Let's pray together. God, thank you so much for your word and the way that it presses against us. I pray this morning, God, that you would help us to suspend our judgment, You'd help us to become the kind of people who take up the works that you've called us to work. And ultimately, God, I pray that we would once more put ourselves in your hands. Thank you with this blind man that you are the potter making clay and refashioning. And God, I pray for each one in this room this morning that they would find themselves once more in your hands, being refashioned by you as you make clay and you smear it all over us and you rework us and refashion us. Make it so, I pray, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And together we all said, amen. Amen.